You guys have been absolutely flooding my comments asking for this type of content. And after months of digging through submissions, I finally found 3 stories that will make you think twice about ever going up on a rooftop again. I'm talking about real experiences from real people who thought they were just going up for a quick smoke break to catch a sunset, or maybe just to escape the chaos below. But what they found up there was something far more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. These aren't your typical ghost stories or urban legends. These are genuine encounters that happen to ordinary people in places that should have been safe. Now, before we dive into these nightmare scenarios, let me tell you something that's going to blow your mind. I spent over 40 hours going through hundreds of submissions to find these 3 stories. I had to verify details, cross-reference locations, and make sure these were authentic experiences. Most of the stories I received were either too similar to others I'd heard or just didn't have that genuine feeling that separates real terror from made-up nonsense. But these 3 stories, they kept me up at night. They made me question whether I'd ever feel comfortable on a rooftop again. And by the end of this video, I guarantee you'll understand exactly why rooftops can be some of the most dangerous places you never thought to worry about. What makes rooftop encounters so uniquely terrifying is the isolation factor. You're elevated, often with limited escape routes, and if something goes wrong, help is far away. You can scream all you want, but who's really going to hear you from 6 stories up? These stories prove that sometimes the most horrifying experiences happen in places where you think you're completely alone. The first story comes from Marcus, a 24-year-old college student who was living in a downtown apartment building during his senior year. This happened on a Tuesday night in late October, and what started as a routine study break turned into an experience that still haunts him to this day. Marcus had been cramming for midterms for what felt like weeks straight. His roommate had friends over, and the apartment was getting loud and chaotic. He needed somewhere quiet to clear his head, so he decided to head up to the rooftop of his building. It was an old converted warehouse that had been turned into student housing, and the rooftop was technically off limits, but the door was never locked, and students went up there all the time. The building was 8 stories tall, and the rooftop had this amazing view of the city skyline. Marcus had been up there maybe a dozen times before, usually during the day or early evening. But this time it was close to midnight, and he figured he'd have the place completely to himself. He grabbed his textbook and headed up the stairwell. The stairwell was one of those industrial concrete ones with metal railings and fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. As Marcus climbed higher, he noticed that some of the lights on the upper floors were burnt out, making the climb progressively darker. By the time he reached the 8th floor, he was using his phone's flashlight to navigate the last few steps. The rooftop door was heavy and made this loud scraping sound when he pushed it open. The night air hit him immediately, and he could hear the distant sounds of traffic and nightlife from the streets below. The rooftop itself was pretty basic, just concrete with some utility equipment scattered around, and a small ledge that ran along the perimeter. Marcus found his usual spot near the center of the roof, away from the edge and sat down with his back against one of the ventilation units. He opened his textbook and started reading, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the pages. The white noise of the city below was actually pretty relaxing, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could actually focus. He'd been reading for maybe 20 minutes when he heard something that made him look up. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the concrete. At first, he thought it might be debris blowing in the wind, but there was barely any breeze that night. He looked around but couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond his small circle of phone light. Marcus went back to his reading, but the sound came again. This time it was more distinct, like footsteps but with a dragging quality to them. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice echoed off the surrounding buildings, but there was no response. The sounds of the city continued below, but up on the rooftop everything had gone eerily quiet. He stood up and started walking slowly toward where he thought the sound had come from. As he moved his phone's light across the rooftop, he could see the various pieces of equipment casting long shadows. The scraping sound came again, and this time he was sure it was coming from the far corner of the roof near the fire escape. Marcus approached cautiously, his heart starting to beat faster. As he got closer to the corner, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the concrete leading from the fire escape toward the center of the roof. But these weren't normal footprints. They were smeared and irregular, as if whoever was making them was having trouble walking properly. The footprints led in a winding path across the rooftop, and Marcus followed them with his light. They seemed to circle around the area where he'd been sitting, then head back toward the fire escape. But what really disturbed him was that the prints looked fresh, and they were definitely wet, even though it hadn't rained in days. Marcus called out again, louder this time. "I know someone's up here. This is private property." Still no response, but the scraping sound returned, and now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions. He spun around, trying to track the source with his phone light, but the sound kept moving. That's when he saw them. In the beam of his flashlight, about 30 feet away, he could make out the silhouette of a person standing near the edge of the roof. The figure was completely motionless, just standing there facing away from him. Marcus couldn't make out any details, but something about the person's posture seemed wrong, like they were leaning at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" Marcus shouted. "You can't be up here." The figure didn't respond or move. Marcus started walking toward them, his phone light bouncing with each step. As he got closer, he could see that the person was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be barefoot, which would explain the wet footprints. When Marcus was about 15 feet away, he stopped. Something about the whole situation felt incredibly wrong. The person hadn't moved or acknowledged him at all, and up close their posture looked even more unnatural. They seemed to be swaying slightly, as if they were struggling to maintain their balance. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice much quieter now. "Do you need help?" Still no response. The figure just continued to sway gently in place. Marcus took another step forward, and that's when he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The person's feet weren't touching the ground. They were hovering about 6 inches above the concrete. and the wet footprints he'd been following seemed to end several feet away from where the figure was standing. Marcus blinked hard and rubbed his eyes, thinking he must be seeing things wrong, but when he looked again, the figure was still suspended in the air. Marcus backed away slowly, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone steady. The figure began to turn around, moving in a slow, mechanical way that didn't look human. Marcus didn't wait to see what was facing him. He turned and ran toward the rooftop door as fast as he could, his phone light bouncing wildly as he sprinted across the concrete. He reached the door and yanked it open, practically throwing himself into the stairwell. As he started down the stairs, he could hear the scraping sound again, but now it seemed to be following him. He didn't look back, just kept running down flight after flight of stairs until he reached his apartment. Marcus burst through his door, startling his roommate and friends. When they asked what was wrong, he couldn't even explain what he'd seen. He just locked the door and spent the rest of the night sitting by his window, staring up at the rooftop. But he never saw anything else. The next morning, Marcus went back up to the rooftop in broad daylight, thinking maybe he'd imagined the whole thing or misunderstood what he'd seen. But when he got there, he found something that confirmed his worst fears. The wet footprints were still there, dried now, but clearly visible on the concrete. And they still ended several feet away from the edge of the roof, with no explanation for how they'd gotten there. Marcus moved out of that building 2 weeks later. He never went back to that rooftop, and to this day he won't go on any rooftop alone after dark. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare experiences I'm about to share with you. The second story takes place in a completely different setting, but it's equally terrifying for entirely different reasons. This one involves Sarah, a 28-year-old nurse who worked night shifts at a hospital downtown. What happened to her proves that sometimes the most dangerous encounters happen in the places where you least expect them. Sarah had been working at Metropolitan General Hospital for about 3 years, and she'd developed a routine for dealing with the stress of 12-hour night shifts. Around 2 in the morning, when things usually quieted down, she'd take her 15-minute break and head up to the hospital's rooftop garden area. It wasn't much of a garden, really, just a small section with some benches and a few planters, but it was the only place in the building where she could get fresh air and see the sky. The hospital was a 15-story building, and the rooftop area was on the 14th floor, with the mechanical equipment and elevator shaft taking up the top floor. Access was restricted to staff only, and you needed a key card to get through the door. Sarah had been going up there for months without any issues. It was her little sanctuary during those long, exhausting shifts. On this particular night in March, Sarah was having one of those shifts where everything seemed to go wrong. They'd had 3 emergency admissions, 2 code blues, and a patient who kept trying to leave against medical advice. She desperately needed those few minutes of peace on the rooftop to collect herself before finishing the last half of her shift. She badged into the stairwell and climbed the 2 flights to the rooftop access door. The hospital kept the rooftop dimly lit with just a few security lights positioned around the perimeter. Sarah had her usual spot on a bench near the center of the space, where she could see the city lights and feel like she was somewhere other than inside that sterile hospital environment. As she sat down and pulled out her phone to check her messages, she heard the access door open behind her. She turned around, expecting to see one of the other nurses or maybe a doctor taking a break, but nobody came through the door. The hallway beyond was empty, and the door slowly swung shut with its usual heavy thud. Sarah figured someone had probably started to come up but changed their mind. It happened sometimes, especially if they got called back to their floor. She went back to her phone, trying to decompress from the hectic night. The cool air felt good on her face, and for the first time in hours, she started to feel her shoulders relax. About 5 minutes later, she heard footsteps on the concrete behind her. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking carefully in the dim light. Sarah turned around again, ready to greet whoever had joined her, but there was nobody there. The rooftop was empty except for her, and the footsteps had stopped. This time, Sarah stood up and walked toward the access door. She checked to make sure it was properly closed and locked, which it was. She even looked down the stairwell to see if someone might be lingering there, but it was empty. She was starting to feel uneasy, but she told herself she was just exhausted and hearing things. Sarah went back to her bench, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She kept glancing around the rooftop, half expecting to see someone emerge from behind one of the utility structures or planters. The security lights created pools of dim yellow light with dark shadows between them, and her mind started playing tricks on her. That's when she heard her name being called. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was definitely her name. Sarah. She spun around, her heart racing, but once again there was nobody there. The voice had seemed to come from the direction of the building's edge, where the rooftop overlooked the parking lot 14 floors below. Sarah called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice echoed off the surrounding buildings, but there was no response. She was seriously considering going back inside when she heard her name again, this time more clearly. "Sarah, come here." The voice was coming from the darkness near the rooftop's edge, beyond the reach of the security lights. Every instinct Sarah had was telling her to go back inside, but something compelled her to investigate. She walked slowly toward the edge of the rooftop, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night air. As she approached the perimeter, she could see the lights of the parking lot far below and the empty streets beyond. "Sarah." The voice came again, and this time it seemed to be coming from over the edge of the building. Sarah approached the low concrete barrier that ran along the rooftop's perimeter and looked down. The parking lot was mostly empty, with just a few cars scattered around under the streetlights. She couldn't see anyone who might have been calling her name, but then she heard something that made her blood run cold. The voice came again, but this time it was directly behind her. "Sarah, don't turn around." She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The voice was close, maybe just a few feet away, and it sounded wrong somehow. It was using her name, but the tone was flat and emotionless, like someone reading from a script. Sarah's hands gripped the concrete barrier so tightly her knuckles went white. She wanted to turn around, but something about the voice made her afraid to move. It spoke again, still right behind her. "Sarah, you need to jump. It's the only way to make the pain stop." That's when Sarah realized what was happening. She was being told to jump from the 14th floor of the hospital. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. She'd been working in healthcare long enough to know that sometimes people experiencing severe mental health crises could become fixated on getting others to harm themselves. But this felt different. This felt supernatural. The voice continued, always staying directly behind her no matter which way she faced. "Sarah, you're so tired. You're so tired of everything. Just step over the barrier, it will be quick, and then you can rest forever." The words seemed to burrow into her mind, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah actually considered what the voice was suggesting. She was exhausted. She was stressed. She was dealing with death and suffering every single day at work. Maybe it would be easier to just... Sarah shook her head violently, trying to clear the thoughts. This wasn't her. These weren't her thoughts. Something was trying to manipulate her, and she needed to get away from it immediately. Sarah turned around quickly, ready to run back to the access door, but what she saw made her scream. Standing about 3 feet away was a figure that looked almost human, but not quite. It was tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a hospital gown. But its face was completely wrong. The features were blurred and indistinct, as if someone had smeared a photograph before it could develop properly. The thing spoke again, and Sarah could see that its mouth wasn't moving in sync with the words. "Sarah, you can't leave. You belong here with us. All the nurses who couldn't handle the pain anymore. We're waiting for you." Sarah ran. She sprinted across the rooftop toward the access door, fumbling for her keycard as she ran. Behind her, she could hear multiple voices now, all calling her name, all telling her to come back. She swiped her card and yanked the door open, throwing herself into the stairwell. As she ran down the stairs, she could hear the voices following her, echoing in the stairwell. But gradually, as she got further from the rooftop, they faded away. By the time she reached the 12th floor, everything was quiet again. Sarah went straight to her supervisor and told her she was feeling sick and needed to go home. She never mentioned what had happened on the rooftop, but she never went back up there again. She requested to be transferred to day shifts, and eventually she left that hospital entirely. Years later, Sarah did some research and discovered that 3 nurses from that hospital had died by suicide over the past decade, and all 3 had jumped from the same rooftop where she'd had her encounter. She never found out if what she experienced was real or if it was some kind of psychological manifestation of the trauma that building held. But she knew she'd never forget those voices calling her name. The third and final story is perhaps the most disturbing of all because it involves someone who wasn't alone on the rooftop. This one comes from Jake, a 31-year-old security guard who was working the night shift at an office building when he encountered something that still gives him nightmares 5 years later. Jake was responsible for security at a 12-story office complex downtown. Part of his nightly routine involved checking all the floors, including the rooftop, to make sure everything was secure. He'd been doing this job for about 2 years and had never encountered anything more exciting than the occasional homeless person trying to sleep in the lobby. The building's rooftop was used mainly for mechanical equipment and cell tower installations. There was a small area with a few chairs where office workers sometimes took their lunch breaks during the day. But at night it was supposed to be completely empty. On this particular night in September, Jake was making his rounds around 11:30. He'd checked all the floors and was heading up to the rooftop for his final sweep of the building. As he climbed the stairs to the roof access, he noticed that the door at the top was slightly ajar, which was unusual because it was supposed to be kept locked at all times. Jake approached the door cautiously and listened for any sounds from the other side. He could hear what sounded like quiet conversation, but he couldn't make out the words. He assumed it was probably some teenagers who had somehow gotten onto the roof, which happened occasionally despite the building's security measures. He pushed the door open and stepped onto the rooftop, ready to tell whoever was there that they needed to leave, but what he saw made him stop in his tracks. There were about 6 people sitting in a circle near the center of the roof, and they all turned to look at him as he appeared in the doorway. The group appeared to be having some kind of meeting or gathering. They were all adults, dressed in normal street clothes, and they seemed calm and non-threatening. Jake relaxed slightly and approached them, preparing to explain that they couldn't be on the roof after hours. "Evening, folks," Jake called out as he walked toward them. "I'm going to need you to head back downstairs. The rooftop is off limits after business hours." The group continued to stare at him, but nobody responded. As Jake got closer, he could see their faces more clearly in the dim light from the building's security fixtures. That's when he noticed something that made his stomach turn. None of them were blinking. They were all staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes, and their faces were completely expressionless. Jake stopped walking and called out again, louder this time. "Did you hear me? You need to leave now." One of the people in the circle, a woman in a business suit, finally spoke. "We've been waiting for you, Jake." Her voice was monotone and flat, and hearing his name made Jake's blood run cold. He hadn't told them his name, and he wasn't wearing a name tag. "How do you know my name?" Jake asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and it didn't reach her eyes at all. "We know everything about you, Jake. We know about your daughter, Emma. We know about your wife, Lisa. We know about the debt you're hiding from them." The woman's voice remained completely flat, even as she revealed personal information that Jake had never shared with anyone. Jake started backing toward the door, but another member of the group, a man in a polo shirt, stood up and spoke. "We know about the money you've been taking from the building's petty cash fund. $5 here, $10 there. You think nobody notices, but we notice everything." Jake's heart was pounding now. He had been taking small amounts of money from the office's emergency fund, but he'd been careful about it. Nobody should have known. And even if they did, how would random trespassers have access to that information? A third person, an older man in a cardigan, stood up and joined the conversation. "We know about the insurance policy you took out on Lisa, the one she doesn't know about. The one where you're the sole beneficiary. This was information that Jake had never shared with anyone, not even his closest friends. Jake turned and ran toward the door, but it slammed shut just as he reached it. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The door that had been easily opened just minutes earlier was now completely immovable. Jake pounded on it and shouted for help, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the night air. When he turned around, all 6 people were standing now, and they had moved closer to him. They were arranged in a semicircle, blocking his path to the other side of the roof. The woman in the business suit stepped forward and spoke again. "You can't leave, Jake. Not until you make a choice. We know about all the bad things you've done, all the secrets you've been keeping. We can make it all go away, but you have to do something for us first." Jake pressed his back against the door and tried his radio, but it was completely dead. No static, no response, just silence. The group continued to stare at him with their unblinking eyes, and Jake noticed that none of them seemed to be breathing. Their chests weren't rising and falling, and when they spoke, their mouths moved, but no breath was visible in the cool night air. The man in the polo shirt stepped forward. "All you have to do is jump, Jake. Step over the edge and all your problems disappear. Your family will get the insurance money, your debts will be forgiven, and nobody will ever know about the money you stole." Jake shook his head violently. "No, absolutely not. I'm not jumping anywhere. I don't know who you people are or how you know these things, but I'm not listening to this." He tried the door again, pulling and pushing with all his strength, but it remained firmly closed. The group began to move closer, their movements synchronized and unnatural. As they approached, Jake could see that their eyes were completely black with no visible pupils or irises. They were still smiling, those horrible too wide smiles, and their heads were tilted at slightly unnatural angles. "Jake," they all said in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony. "Jake, you know it's the right thing to do. You know you're a bad person. You know your family would be better off without you." Jake closed his eyes and pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out their voices. But the words seemed to come from inside his own head now, echoing his own thoughts and fears. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a bad person. Maybe his family would be better off without him. Jake opened his eyes and looked toward the edge of the roof. It would be so easy to just walk over there and step off. All his problems would be over, and nobody would have to know about the things he'd done. The group was nodding encouragingly, still smiling their horrible smiles. But then Jake thought about Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, and how she always ran to him when he came home from work. He thought about Lisa and how she'd been trying to plan a vacation they couldn't afford, not knowing that Jake had been stealing money to try to make it happen. He thought about how devastated they'd be if he was gone, regardless of his mistakes. Jake took a deep breath and shouted as loud as he could, "I'm not jumping. I don't care what you know about me. I'm not leaving my family." The group's smiles faded and they began to look angry. Their faces started to change, becoming more distorted and less human. Suddenly, the door behind Jake flew open and he stumbled backward into the stairwell. He turned and ran down the stairs as fast as he could, not stopping until he reached the ground floor. When he looked back up the stairwell, he could see the group standing at the top of the stairs, but they weren't following him. Jake quit his job the next day and never went back to that building. He also made some major changes in his life. He confessed to Lisa about the money he'd taken and worked out a plan to pay it back. He canceled the insurance policy and started being honest about their financial situation. He never found out who or what those people were, but their encounter forced him to confront the worst parts of himself. These three stories share some common elements that make rooftop encounters particularly terrifying. The isolation, the height, the limited escape routes, and the psychological vulnerability that comes with being alone in a high place all contribute to an environment where our deepest fears can manifest. Whether these encounters were supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, they all serve as reminders that sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones where we go to find peace. The next time you're tempted to step out onto a rooftop alone, especially at night, remember these stories and ask yourself if it's really worth the risk. If you've had your own rooftop encounter or any other scary experience you'd like to share, leave it in the comments below. And if this video kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button and check out my other horror story collections. Trust me, after hearing these stories, you'll never look at rooftops the same way again.